Suzanne, hello and welcome to Al Jazeera. Now, let me start by asking you, just how closely intertwined is the Russian Orthodox Church and the Kremlin, and to what extent does Putin depend on the ROC's blessing for personal legitimacy and to legitimize his political moves?
Well, hello, and thanks very much for having me today. Yes, indeed, the Russian Orthodox Church is rather connected to the Kremlin. After the fall of communism in Russia, the Orthodox Church was no longer threatened by the leadership during the Bolshevik times and grew into an institution that was highly regarded and respected in Russian society, very much like the armed forces or the FSB. And this was especially prevalent when Putin came into power. And the ROC, as I'll call the Russian Orthodox Church from here on out, is highly intertwined with symbolic politics that the Kremlin also engages in. And this can include, for example, domestically can serve as an as a memory actor, reinforcing Russia's role in history and or mourning, let's say, victims of Stalinism. And then abroad, it can act as a symbolic political soft power force that legitimizes Russia's standing as a kind of conservative power, a holder of traditional values. The thing about the Russian Orthodox Church is that it has many parishes throughout the world, and actually, the Moscow Patriarchate controls these parishes. So, in fact, it's able to exert a lot of influence all over the world because of that. And since the church and the state are rather connected, the Russian politics also influences these parishes globally. And President Putin and Patriarch Kirill have a close relationship and tend to see eye to eye on things such as Russia being threatened by liberal values and the necessity to protect Russian civilization against these encroaching kind of threatening forces. In return, the church receives a lot of economic and financial benefits. Many of the bishops are generally well off. But I wouldn't say that the church is something that Putin depends on for legitimacy. It's more a tool, something that he has worked with in conjunction with while gaining legitimacy in other ways as well. In his first two terms in office, he gained legitimacy as a president because, the standard of living greatly improved during this time. And then also violence was reduced to a significant level. And then later on in his third term, he started to kind of consolidate this post-Soviet Russian national identity that is based on these values of conservatism. And that's also especially when the church had a fundamental symbolic role to play along with that.
Mhm. Now, to what extent does the framing of the conflict in Ukraine as a holy war against the West resonate with the broader Russian populace, and how does this religious dimension affect the likelihood of Russia seeking a negotiated settlement?
Well, see, the narrative of besieged fortress, if you've heard that term before,
Mhm.
is very prevalent and successful in Russia. This can be defined as a portrayal of external threats to Russia's existence and civilization. So if you show that the West is a threat to Russia's existence and identity, then you can justify, let's say, increasing authoritarianism at home as a means to protect your society from the outside, and also increasingly aggressive behavior abroad. So an example here is the color revolutions in neighboring countries that took place in the 2000s. These were looked at through Putin and the elites in Russia as an effort on the Western powers side to inflict regime change in these countries. And they took that as a threat to Russia's internal stability, and therefore were able to justify increasing controls at home. In
Mhm.
addition, the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014 was also partially motivated by what the elite considered a Western effort to encourage regime change in Ukraine so that Ukraine would eventually accede into NATO and EU as a successful democracy. And this was viewed as a direct threat. And subsequently, the annexation of Crimea was very popular, actually, as a move in Russia. So the portrayal of the West as an enemy to undermine Russian society is a very useful political tool to advance Putinist ideals. And especially because Russian society has been historically accustomed to being a great power and respects leaders who stand up to the West. And if you involve the church and religion in this, it adds to this kind of civilizational dimension, invoking feelings of pride and the necessity to act in defense of one's own identity and self-preservation. And then since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Russian society has turned even further away towards the West into a more conservative direction, and this can be seen in education programs in schools. So this would indicate that the elite in Russia views this move away from the West as a long-term pattern and a long-term move, and that does indeed raise the question about whether the West and Russia can achieve some kind of peaceful deal in Ukraine, because at this stage, unless Russia faces some type of defeat on some level, they're only going to try to seek a negotiation purely on their terms, which is not a negotiation at all.
Mm-hmm. Now, your recent Kennan Institute report highlights the Kremlin's use of Eurasianism as a philosophical underpinning for its actions. How effectively does this ideology mask Russia's imperial ambitions under the guise of cultural preservation? And to what extent does this resonate with former Russian republics?
Yes, well, I would say that Putin's cultural turn to conservatism that he led primarily was started in 2012 when he returned to the presidency, and maybe was partially motivated by the 2011 protests by the Russian population once they heard that, he was returning to power. And this could have been a way to consolidate more control at home. And, this was also motivated by the fact that Putin criticized Western actions in Libya recently, or, at that time, and criticized overall Western hegemonic, let's say, actions abroad. And this was a justification to turn more into a more conservative, anti-liberal direction. And Eurasianism, as you mentioned, is a philosophy of Russian cultural conservatism. And its purpose is to unite the large ethnic diversity in Russia, since it's a large country and there are many different ethnic groups. And at the same time, it provides a kind of imperial vision for Russia's role in Eurasia as a whole. The philosophy itself rejects Westernism, or the Western model of development and governance for Russia. It also asserts that Russians and non-Russians in Eurasia should be unified, and that to keep this space unified, you require a kind of imperial form of political organization. So it also uses cultural and civilizational arguments to explain contemporary political events. So this was a very useful and convenient ideology under which to shape Russia's post-Soviet national identity when Putin returned to power in 2012, as it views democratization as a cultural concept, and explains why the 1990s in Russia were such a difficult time and why the country was unable to democratize, because it uses kind of cultural arguments as to why this model is not appropriate for Russia. And it also helps to justify authoritarianism through culture in that sense. And, it's effective at masking these imperial ambitions, because actually, if you think about it, half the world now currently buys the Russian narrative that Russia has some kind of rights in Ukraine. So perhaps this philosophy makes sense to a lot of people, or just, the fact that Russian soft power and media is a powerful tool. And I would say that it's also useful and at convincing both, people within Eurasia and also in the West that it's true that perhaps democracy is not an appropriate form of governance for states with this particular history and, former, imperial style of rule. It works as a unifying force in Russia. I think it's quite successful in that sense, but probably has more mixed results in post-Soviet states since we're
Hmm. Hmm.
seeing more and more that countries that used to be in the Soviet Union are
Right.
increasingly seeking more independence from Moscow as they start to, assert their own national identity as being separate from that of Russia and as being separate from that of this kind of Eurasian combined identity. And where it is successful in Eurasia is probably just because of the comfort of the old narrative and long held view towards their larger, stronger neighbor, and might be used as a justification of centralization of power within their own countries. And lastly, Russian media is quite prevalent all over the former Soviet states and Eurasia, and manages to kind of, push this narrative out quite successfully, as well as the Russian Orthodox Church parishes around the region.
Hmm. Now, would a Russian victory in Ukraine signal to former Soviet states that the future in Western institutions is untenable? And if so, how can the West credibly demonstrate its commitment to these states and provide a viable alternative to Russian hegemony?
Well, if the West had not reacted to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it would be essentially accepting the idea of a Russian sphere of influence,
Hmm.
or that, countries in this area must remain predominantly under Russian political, military, social, and economic influence. So it would, in fact, signal to other countries in the area that this is their fate as well. And this idea is something important to consider for, if the time ever comes for a peace negotiation in Ukraine, because if Russia gains something important from its aggressive actions, this will send a strong signal to former Soviet states that their futures are something that needs to be negotiated between larger powers rather than being their own sovereign choice. So the West can incredibly demonstrate its commitment to these states by, first of all, not condoning or appeasing Russian aggression. It can have a strong response to Russian actions so that, the Russians meet resistance so that their goals are less easily achievable. This can serve as an important deterrent in the future. And, it's important to not to reward aggression because the aggressor would then understand that it is through aggression that they achieve their goals and might repeat that action somewhere else. So I would recommend consolidating partnerships first and foremost with the democratic countries that are already in the EU and NATO and increase their resilience and institutional capacity and deterrent capability. And then countries that are aspiring to join these institutions should, of course, continue to do so. But many of these nations are politically contested and have quite a bit of Russian influence in them. And therefore, it might be wise not to try to engage in, let's say, zero-sum competition, to further destabilize these nations, but rather try, as the West, to remain as the quote unquote preferred choice, setting
Hmm.
a good example domestically in our own societies, as well as providing the needed support and guidance for these countries to achieve their own desired reforms. And also through sustained resistance in Ukraine, the Russian state might eventually kind of lose its ability to be as influential in the region. It's important to note that right now Russia is heavily investing in its military capabilities, and if it's appeased in Ukraine or given what it wants in some type of, immediate peace deal, they'll have much more ability to exert power and influence in the region, and this would be at other countries' dismay.
Right. And finally, considering Russia's history of utilizing information campaigns to sow discord in Western democracies, how should the West adapt its strategic communications to counter these narratives and bolster societal resilience?
Of course, yeah. Well, of course, freedom of thought and speech are vital in any democracy. But now that we have social media, it has allowed for the proliferation of disinformation. And this is a perfect breeding ground for Russian information operations. In the West, especially in the United States and Western Europe, and probably also to an extent, Balkans and Eastern Europe, There's a kind of a identity debate going on about more, between more nativist conceptions of understanding of our own national identities versus more liberal oriented values. And this increasing polarization in the West actually provides such an easy target for Russian disinformation, and it's easy to fuel further identity clashes. So to try to be more resilient towards these forces, it's important to encourage training and education on media literacy, perhaps maybe in schools that can start being implemented on how to recognize biased narratives. Another way would be maybe to increase the use of AI tools on social media platforms that recognize the information as having a particular bias, or saying that this is, false, this is not real information, so that people can understand what they're reading. You mentioned strategic communication. That's very important too. Domestically, for example, in our societies, I feel that the government and the elite groups don't adequately communicate with their population what their foreign policy goals and objectives are and why they are conducting the foreign policy that they're doing. If there was more communication about why it's important to our countries, this could serve as a way to increase trust between the population and the leadership, but also as a way to bolster a type of collective Western identity based on certain values, and that can be explained through the actions abroad in a more, coherent manner, so that people can feel more united in our actions. And it can also be increased abroad because, the Russian and Chinese narrative about how the West is overly dominant and overly hegemonic, it's gaining a lot of traction. It's very popular. This could perhaps be countered by pointing out more the coercive nature of Russian and Chinese foreign policy, and say, well, this is the alternative to Western leadership, and make that message more loud and more clear. And then one last thing on that is, at home and in democratic societies, we're seeing the rise of populism, and this is quite a problem. And this is due to real grievances and perceived grievances. But the way to tackle the problem of rising populism is to address the grievances. We need to address economic inequality. We need to address uncontrolled immigration, so that the population feels that their needs are adequately being met by the leadership.
Right. Suzanne, it was such a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.